Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm Connor, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. It is Saturday, May 15th, 2021. Today we discuss the Fulton County District Attorney's statements surrounding the Atlanta spa shooting, the increasing violence in Israel and Gaza, Project Veritas's pro-Trump spies, and finally, a leak about voter suppression and the activists involved. But before we begin, I would like to address a previous episode we made. 2 weeks ago, I released a podcast episode that examined the investigation into former President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. During that reporting, I mentioned a story that claimed that the FBI had warned Rudy that he was the target of a Russian disinformation campaign. I based my discussion on two stories, one by the New York Times and the other by the Washington Post. Both stories have since been retracted after additional sources revealed that Giuliani did not receive that alert. The FBI did not want to interfere with their investigation by adding more fuel to the fire with said alert, and so they did not deliver it. This is not to suggest that there is no such disinformation campaign or that the FBI was not aware of such attempts by the Kremlin, only that Giuliani was not alerted by the FBI. I apologize for the mistake and will do better in the future. Thank you very much for your time, and with that out of the way, let's get on with the show. The New York Times reported on Tuesday that the prosecutor in the case of the infamous Atlanta shooting has publicly denounced the shooting as a hate crime. Fannie Willis, the district attorney for Fulton County, has publicly alleged that the shooter, who will remain unnamed, targeted his victims based on their race, sex, and gender. While prosecutors in Cherokee County, where the case is being handled for some of the charges, have not suggested hate crime charges, the fact that the prosecutors in other counties are openly calling for a new charge indicates that the area is still reeling from the tragedy of the shooting. Though prosecutors believe that the motivation was due to the shooter's supposed sex addiction, District Attorney Willis argues that such motivation is not exculpatory to the hate crime charge. In a news conference, she argued that the death penalty would be appropriate. She believes this so firmly that she filed a motion in court requesting that the shooter face hate crime charges if convicted of murder. If done, she would be the first prosecutor in Georgia's history to use that power under a new Georgia statute. Overall, I think the district attorney is making the right move. This strikes me as a hate crime, and self-professed sex addiction should not be used as the sole explanation for the massacre of innocent people, as I've noted before. But I do have to object to the punishment. It is one thing to call for a hate crime charge. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. It's to be expected given the circumstances. But to make the public pay for an execution, which is already controversial, is not only unwise, but it will not bring peace to anyone. Executions are subject to numerous appeals that can drag out the sentence for years, bringing out the suffering of the families who lost their loved ones and putting a burden on the state and everyone involved. It is better to charge the shooter with a hate crime, convict them, and throw them away for the rest of their life. It would bring more immediate restitution to the family, avoid the controversy surrounding the death penalty, and show that we, as a society, can carry out just punishments without dividing ourselves into factions. I know this is a sensitive issue, and I respect that. But if we are to provide peace to those who suffered the most, then the restitution needs to be immediate, and that's what imprisonment provides. In other news, newfound malfeasance on the part of the Trump administration's allies has spurred outrage against Project Veritas. The New York Times reported on Thursday that a network of conservative advocates and activists attempted to discredit the supposed enemies of the Trump administration through spying. Project Veritas, which conservative activist James O'Keefe founded, is the infamous spying organization that has been known for deceptively editing its videos to make officials appear as anti-conservative and anti-Trump. According to the Times, women were recruited to date some of the officers while trying to record them in the hopes that these agents would say things that would compromise their positions in government. Usually they were looking for something that would be negative about Trump. One of those who was directly involved was former British spy Richard Seddon, who worked with Project Veritas' security contractor Eric Prince. Prince has been at the forefront of conservative efforts to discredit Trump's political rivals, making him a prime suspect in these operations. It is not completely clear whether or not Trump or his cabinet were directly involved, but considering they had access to General McMaster's personal schedule for their stings, it would not be surprising. One of the operatives deployed against McMaster, Barbara Ladine, stated that she was brought on by someone with direct access to that schedule. One of the plans that Veritas hoped to carry out was to send a woman with a camera to expose McMaster being negative about then-President Trump. Mind you, McMaster was the national security advisor to the president at the time. It is one thing to oppose someone, but it is another thing entirely to turn the faculties of government against people you don't like. The Trump administration, though perhaps not involved, needs to answer questions about this report. The conspiracy theory that a deep state seeks to undermine Trump and his conservative allies is part of the issue here. For years, Republicans have aided and abetted Trump's absurd claim that there was a deep state within our government without so much as a single piece of evidence. What did they expect to happen? Of course people like James O'Keefe came forward. They wanted to prove this lie with the same amateurish conspiracism that pro-Trump Republicans promote constantly. I don't want to exaggerate what we are dealing with here, but this is serious. Our government was fighting within itself for the profit and benefit of a private, partisan smear organization. If there aren't some consequences soon, it'll be a stain on the American political system in the long term. It is important that we don't let Nixonian tricks like this continue. Our government is meant to run as a smooth system that isn't being undermined by hacks and political activists seeking to score political points. We'll be back after this break with more news in a moment. Stay tuned. If you enjoy getting out in the media world, you might just want to start a podcast of your own. It's not easy without the right equipment, and Buzzsprout is just the piece of equipment to make your podcast work for you. You get access to all the major podcast apps for your show, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, and so much more. I have a subscription to Buzzsprout, and I couldn't be happier. It is easy to use, easy to edit, and easy to upload on a timely basis. They're a critical part of my work, and soon they could be a part of yours. If you follow the link in the show notes, it lets Buzzsprout know we sent you, and gets you a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan. Not to mention, it helps support our show. Join over 1,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now that we're back, I need to address a development that came up from a previous podcast. Last week, I covered the violence that broke out at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Israel, one of the holiest sites in Islam. At the moment, I was not aware of the large-scale violence that would erupt. Unfortunately, things have gotten so much worse than I anticipated, and now some United Nations officials are warning of an all-out war. I can't pretend to be an expert on this, so please take what I say with some restraint. However, what I do know is that this was not random. For those unfamiliar with the issue at hand, we must look back to 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War, defeating multiple hostile countries. During that time, Israel took control of Jerusalem and all of its holy sites. However, the Palestinians, who have lived there since the days of the Ottoman Empire, continue to hold that East Jerusalem is the capital of an eventual Palestinian state. Fast forward to today, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, part of East Jerusalem, have been forced from their homes by Israeli officers. Some Israelis assert that the land in question once belonged to Jewish residents before 1948, when Israel was formed. Under current Israeli law, those Israelis who claim that their land was taken from them in the previous conflict can seek to have that land returned to them with court-ordered force. However, Palestinians are not entitled to the same restitution. So when Israeli officers began evicting and forcing people from their homes with extreme force, violence exploded. This was further complicated by protesters at Al-Aqsa throwing rocks at Israeli nationalists who were celebrating the Israeli victory of 1967 with the controversial flag demonstration. And that resulted in last week's raid on the famous mosque. By the end of these series of fights, inner-city riots and violence broke out. Hamas fired thousands of rockets, and Israel responded with bombings that have lasted for at least 5 days. The BBC reports that a minimum of 133 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip as of today. I said in my last podcast that America should not provide preference to one side or the other, and I stand by that. The sooner America takes a side with one of the factions, it will lose the ability to influence the other. However, with the devastating level of destruction that Israel has waged, and considering the early events that ignited this conflict, America must be willing to call out Israel's concessions to its nationalist wing in the parliament. Both Hamas and Netanyahu depend upon the people remaining terrified and angry to stay in power. Hamas canceled elections under the pretense that Palestinians were in no condition to vote, conveniently keeping them in control. On the other side, Netanyahu faces corruption charges and can't be held accountable so long as he remains prime minister. He failed to establish a new government this year, and his opposition was gaining steam. But now, with this open warfare, it seems unlikely he will be leaving soon. In other words, if you want to look for where to target your anger, look to the leaders in power. To be clear, I'm not saying this is a both sides thing, strange as that may sound. Israel has a massive amount of power here, and they are responsible for how they wield it. Already, Israel has attacked several United Nations facilities that international law protects. They are clearly marked as well. That's a clear violation. But Israel will not suddenly abandon its security measures, and Palestine is not about to establish a state overnight. Peace and diplomacy must be the ultimate goal. We can't throw people into the meat grinder just because of political allegiances. The Biden administration must act as a mediator, hold Israel accountable for its abuses, and ensure that Hamas ends its launches. Peace must be the ultimate goal. Turning to our last story of the day, we turn to a leaked video from a conservative dark money group, Heritag Action, a sister organization to the Heritage Foundation. Executive Director Jessica Anderson was recorded describing exactly how she and her allies were able to persuade state legislatures to enact voter suppression bills. The leaked video, now released by Mother Jones, shows how she describes how in Iowa, they secretly helped Republicans to pass restrictions on the American citizens' right to vote. Describing their operation, Anderson said, quote, "We were working with these state legislatures to make sure they have all the information they need to draft the bills," end quote. Boasting to her audience of like-minded Republicans, Anderson further noted that they were able to not only keep their involvement in Iowa's voter restrictions secret, but they were also pressuring Georgia Governor Brian Kemp into signing new restrictions as well. They also have plans for Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and other states that played a major role in the previous presidential election. According to her now leaked statements, Heritag Action went so far as to write draft versions of the laws they wanted for state legislatures to pass. If you wanted to find a secretive group of rich politicos rigging the election, this is the closest you're going to get. If this continues, there is a serious chance that Republicans will again gerrymander and alter the election game to stay in power irrespective of the will of the people. If a democracy is to stand, it cannot permit this kind of activity to continue. There needs to be greater federal protections for voting rights against this kind of backroom manipulation. Whatever your political affiliations, the fact of the matter is that these people, with their monetary power and their ability to influence our system without having to disclose a thing in their activism, are now attempting to change the laws of our election systems on a state-by-state basis. That alone should provoke outrage. That's all for today. Thank you all for joining me. I'll be back next week, and I look forward to talking to you all again. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with friends or on Twitter and Facebook. It helps the show a lot. I'm Connor, signing off.